afternoon, everyone. I want to thank y'all for coming out, and I want to go ahead and get started. A lot of faces I know, some faces I don't. So just to give you a brief introduction about myself, my name is Umar Johnson, and I'm a nationally certified school psychologist. And what I do as a psychologist is I evaluate school-aged children between 3 and 21, and I determine whether or not they have educational disabilities and whether or not they need special education placement. Any child who goes into special ed only goes there because they were properly, or should have been properly, evaluated by a school psychologist who diagnoses them with one of 13 educational disabilities as recognized by the Pennsylvania Department of Education and the Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act of the federal government. And once it has been determined by a school psychologist that you have one of these 13 educational disabilities, we then ask the question of whether or not the child will need a special form of instruction in order to make progress. If the child doesn't need a special form of instruction in order to make progress, you don't get special ed. In other words, you don't get special ed just because you got a disability. You can have a disability and not need it. You only get it because you have a disability plus you need it. Very important. For example, you can have a child who's dyslexic, okay, but if they're a true dyslexic child, and we tend to think all of our kids are dyslexic when they're not, but if they're a truly dyslexic child, there's really not much you can do about that if they're reading backwards, which is only one form of dyslexia. Dyslexia just means a serious reading problem. But if they have the dyslexia that causes them to read backwards, there's not much you can do about it because it's a neurological problem. And so what you would do is keep them in a regular class, and the teacher would score their work backwards. In other words, if it's a problem that you can't fix, you accommodate to it. Okay? You only need special education if you can't accommodate to it in a regular classroom. Okay? My last lecture series I did here from April to July was on psychoeducational issues, and I didn't bring any copies of those tapes because I have them on audio tape. But I'll make sure I have them at my next presentation in November, so you can have that if it's something that you want. But we did one lecture right here in April on the history of blacks in education. I have that on tape. The second one was Supreme Court decisions of black education, which basically shows you how the federal government through the United States Supreme Court has been one of the major enemies to black education in this country. But along with that, I'll point out some ways that you can use the law to benefit yourself and your children. That was a powerful one. The third one was on psychotropic drugging and the Ritalin and the Adderall and the Strattera and that whole phenomenon, which hasn't slowed down yet. And we'll talk about that a little bit today. And then the fourth one was on special ed, segregation by another name. Okay, and basically what I said was specific learning disability, which is the most popular of those 13 I just talked about. Specific learning disability was created in Chicago, Illinois 1 year before the Civil Rights Act of '64. Why? Because Brown versus Board had already outlawed discrimination on race grounds in '54. So when the Civil Rights Act came in '64, they needed some sort of strategy whereby they could continue to separate black kids from white kids, so they came up with specific learning disability. And most black children in special ed are in there because of this subjective diagnosis that says even though they have normal intelligence, they can't learn a skill. They can't be proven. There's no test that can screen for a specific learning disability, just like there's really no test that can screen for ADHD. Okay, them two. Specific learning disability, SLD and ADHD, okay, is like a plague on our community. And it's primarily a plague because it's our fault that we let our kids get these diagnoses in the first place. And they wouldn't even have them if we learn how to raise them properly. A lot of this just comes out of poor parenting styles. As I always say, we don't have a child problem, we have a parent problem, because every kid out there killing, selling crack, or dropping out came out of somebody's house. Okay? So you gotta look at the tree, not the fruit. Fruit don't grow themselves. You gotta look at the tree. Anyhow, tonight is part 1 of 3 of Black Family in Crisis. Tonight we're going to deal with the tragedy of child molestation, rape, incest, and domestic violence. And then on Thursday, November the 8th, we're going to deal with teenage pregnancy and the sexual behavior of our teens. And then in December, second week in December, I have the flyers over there. Make sure you get one at the end of the night's presentation. We're going to deal with black male-female relationships and black marriage. Okay, which is going to be pretty interesting. But tonight we're dealing with this. And the reason I chose to come out the gate with this one is because as a school psychologist, it is a growing phenomenon in our community. We hear a lot about black-on-black violence in the street, but we don't hear anything about the violence going on in our homes. And the violence going on in our homes is as bad as, if not worse than, the violence going on in the street. And the reason why we don't hear much about it is because it's a very sensitive topic. Number one, that's my business. Number two, that's her life. Number three, I don't want the law in my world. Okay? Number four, it can make preachers and ministers look bad. Okay? Especially when people who give a lot of money to the congregational efforts are the ones doing the abusing. Politicians like to cover up constituents who do a lot for them if they are abusers. I say that to say that men or women, okay, who become abusers tend to have a power complex. So they tend to be people who either have no power or already too much. And I know firsthand, because I get phone calls, that within our churches, and it's sick, that we have certain people, I'm not talking about the Catholic Church, I'm talking about black churches, where big name people are molesting the children, and no one's saying nothing about it, including the child's parents, because of this religious control that they have over y'all, or us. Okay? So, we got to talk about that tonight because the children are suffering. Now, people say, well, why would you put domestic violence with child molestation, rape, and incest? That answer's real simple. Okay? Children who live in homes where mother is battered are 10 times as likely to get abused. So they go hand in hand. Rarely will you see children getting abused where the mom is getting abused too. Okay? Abuse can be sexual, it can be physical, and it can be verbal. Don't overlook the verbal abuse. In fact, that's the worst form. Okay? Because the physical scars can heal. Okay? You can potentially suppress, although not effectively, the sexual abuse, but when you are verbally abused, what happens is the abuse gets internalized. Like post-traumatic slavery disorder. It gets internalized, and you become the perpetrator against your own self. So the verbal abuse is very key. Okay? And we have this thing called vicarious abuse. What's vicarious abuse? That's when mom is getting beat, or dad is getting beat, and the children see it. Just by seeing it, they can get traumatized. Because you get people who say, well, I didn't touch them. It was just me and the mom with the problems. Yes, but they saw it. They saw it, and the brain cannot distinguish between what it says, what it sees, and what it does. It's all the same. The brain can't tell whether it's your imagination kicking in or your real-life perception. Very important. Well, I forgot we got a new thing here today. We moved up. Which is correct. I can actually control it myself.
Technology.
Okay, the other way. Got it. All right. I'm not that technological, you know. Sophisticated. Okay, let's start off. It's your problem too. Studies find that 50% of all women will be impacted by domestic violence within their lifetime. Half! It's even higher for black women. Why? Because rape and violence are what? Issues of power, not sex. So when people commit this, although there's a sexual element, anyone who denies that is lying, particularly with rape and molestation, but it is predominantly about power. Why do we see more of this, sometimes manifested in powerless groups? Because men and women have a natural psychological need to control their environment. And so when you go to work and you deal with racism there, and if you're in the community and you deal with racism there,